Welcome everyone in this plenary session on energy at the Crossroads. My name is Josephine Vanhelle. I'm a researcher here at the university, and I will be guiding us for the next 1.5 hours through this session. We will be starting with a keynote by Chancel, and then have Nikita and Alfredo Saad-Filho as discussants to Lucas' talk, after which there will be time for Lucas to respond to their reflections, and that will also be the start of the panel discussion, for which there's also time for your questions. Let me start with welcoming Lucas Chancel with us today from France. Bienvenue. He is a professor in economics at Sciences Po and co-director of the World Inequality Lab of the Paris School of Economics. And his research focuses on the deep interlinkages between inequality and environmental crisis, and as well as on how social, ecological, and also institutional policy responses can take this more systemic perspective into account. And his previous book on unsustainable inequalities won several prestigious prizes for the analysis that it makes there. And recently you co-authored also the Climate Inequality Report of 2025, which focused already on the role of capital and capital ownership. More recently, very recently, the Global Justice Report you co-authored on, which take this analysis a step further into a quantified modeling of how of the possibility to combine limiting global warming below 2 degrees with reaching decent living standards for all citizens by the end of this century. So I think it marks a major contribution to the academic literature across disciplines, but also on the public debate on the theme of this conference of shaping sustainable futures. Today, you will talk about, the talk will be centered on your new book, Énergie et Inégalité, une histoire politique. The English translation is still underway, I understood. And it connects the themes of today's session, so energy, equity, democracy. Please, Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to hear, and thank you for organizing this conference and this event. And what I'm going to talk about is this book, Energy and Inequality: A Political History. The English version is forthcoming. And the key argument is that energy is not just a technical issue, nor an issue of whether we should use more or less energy. It's really at the heart of these discussions about technology, about sufficiency, about energy use. I see a challenge over ownership, conflicts over who owns energy, conflicts over who controls energy capital. And this is at the heart of this book and this research. I come from let's say, economic inequality economics and environmental economics or ecological economics, and I've spent quite a bit of time over the past few years to contribute to this growing field of the study of climate inequalities, measuring who contributes to pollution, who is impacted by pollution, who has capacities to act when it comes to the energy transition. But my understanding here is that our knowledge of climate inequalities and how these inequalities are embedded in technical and political economy constraints remains limited today. And so this is the proposal of this book. It's to study climate and energy inequalities within the broader set of socio-technical systems, which I'm going to call here energy regimes. And the idea here is to try to better understand who owns energy, how control is exerted over it, and to what end, to serve what interest, and to produce what set of outputs, of material outcomes, or of inequality outcomes. And in fact, there is a very rich history of conflicts in democracies over the use, the control, the production, the distribution of energy sources. This is not a new challenge, but it is indeed taking a new form, different form in the context of the energy transition, which, for the better or the worse, will reshape potentially very largely the distribution of capital. And so this is what I'd like to discuss today. And the starting point really is the inequality landscape. And this is work we've done with my colleagues at the World Inequality Lab. So this is global income and wealth inequality today. This is 2023 data, very similar data if we were to look at 2025 or 2026 data that is available on the World Inequality Database. So looking at income on the left, you see that the bottom 50% of the population makes about 8% of the total, when the top 10% captures 54% of all incomes worldwide. Now, looking at wealth inequalities, which is really what is going to be the focus largely of this discussion, well, the top 10%, the richest 10%, own about 3/4 of everything there is to own on this planet, when the bottom half of the population owns 2% of it. And it's going to be very hard to think about, to understand, or to discuss energy transition or ecological challenges without having these very basic facts about the distribution of global wealth in mind. Now, let's put a little bit of historical perspective in this in these numbers. So this is from 1820 on the left to 2020 on the right-hand side. And the indicator, the blue curve, is one indicator of inequality. There are many of them, as you know well. This one is just the ratio of the top 10% average incomes to the bottom 50% average incomes at the global level. So to some extent, it's a ratio of the green curve to the blue curve. The average income of the top 10% to the average income of the bottom 50%. And you see that this gap was about 20 in 1820 and rises to about 40 times the gap between top 10 and bottom 50 in the early 19th century. It oscillates afterwards, rises a little bit, but we're still on a relatively very high inequality plateau from a historical perspective. And most of the increase over this period of 2 centuries actually occurs between 1820 to 1920, so the rise of imperialism in the context of the Industrial Revolution, which is indeed inseparable from the global reorganization of labor and capital enabled by imperialism. So again, this is another very important background on which it's going to be very hard to avoid if we want to speak, to discuss, to understand current and contemporary energy challenges. And here's a third key important fact, which really speaks about the very particular nature of the current period, of the past 30 years. So this is the past 30 years, 1995, 2025. And this is the growth rate of wealth of the entire global population, from the poorest on the left to the very richest on the right-hand side. For each of these groups, percentiles of the global distribution of wealth, what you see is the per adult annual growth rate in wealth, net of inflation, 2%, 3%, up to 4% if you look at the bottom 70% of the distribution, and it drops a little bit. And then at the very, very top, you see growth rates in wealth of up to 9% per year. This means that when you tax, if we were to tax those billionaires at the very top at a rate of 2%, like my colleague, for instance, Gabriel Zuckman is advocating, well, their wealth would still grow on average by 7% per year, right? So very particular period in terms of wealth accumulation, concentration at the very, very top. This really is a billionaire age. And so let's try to start to connect this with the ecological challenges we have in mind. So this is the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, 429 parts per million in 2026. And it's indeed striking change as compared to the past 10,000 years. Human civilizations flourished in a very stable CO2 concentration environment. Now, these CO2 emissions are, from my perspective, essentially an inequality problem. And here I'm quoting Jim Boyce, ecological economist at Amherst, UMass Amherst in the US. In 1994, he has this influential paper in ecological economics entitled Inequality as a Cause for Environmental Degradation, where he argues that for pollution to happen, you need to have winners and losers. Without winners, pollution is a trivial problem. It's easy to solve. And without losers, well, there's no pollution. Note that losers are not necessarily humans. They're not necessarily born yet. They don't necessarily know that they are losing. But you really need winners and losers to have pollution. And inspired by this kind of work, what we've done with colleagues is to look at different ways to understand this climate inequality problem. And we've called this the triple climate inequality challenge, where you have an inequality in emissions, in contributions, that's the green curve. And you see that according to these measures, the top 10% contribute to about more or less 50% of total emissions. And there are different ways to measure this. I might say a few words on that later on. When the bottom 50% contribute to about 10% of the total. Now, relative losses, this is an indicator of your relative income loss due to climate change, how much you're losing with respect to your initial level of income. And 75% of these relative losses are concentrated among the bottom 50% of the distribution. So kind of a mirror image between those who contribute and those who are impacted. That's one way to understand why there is delayed action. Winners and losers, those who are winning from pollution to some extent are the least impacted by it. And then I think the third series of bars is also very important. Capacity to finance, here proxied by the distribution of wealth, ownership, where you see that the capacity to act, to invest in the transition is indeed also very highly unequally distributed. So climate change as an inequality problem. And there comes the questions raised and asked in this book, beyond the current picture, beyond these metrics on energy and climate inequalities, how can we better understand the relationship between energy production, energy systems, and inequality systems, so to say? How have wealth inequality conditioned energy used across countries? And how is the energy transition reshaping the map of global inequalities and inequalities within countries? So these are the key questions raised in this book, Energy and Inequality, A Political History. And the main arguments are the following. Energy is a social and political fact. It is a problem of capital. Wealth inequalities will be profoundly reshaped by the energy transition. This can go towards less inequality, but this could also be inequality enhancing, depending on who is going to make and control all the required energy investments that need to be made in the world. And looking at the long history of energy, it really comes out that energy is a total social fact. Controlling it means controlling rents, controlling uses of energy. It's very hard to properly understand the Anthropocene without studying energy control itself. And energy has actually been central to inequality making from the discovery of fire to solar panels. Now, the book goes back as far as the discovery of fire, but I won't discuss that right now, and I will focus on the core of the empirical contribution of the book, which is the past 200 years, which is already quite a bit, I would say. Well, and over this past 200 years, there were fierce economic and political conflicts on who should control production, consumption. And what's quite interesting is the variety of outcomes, of institutional outcomes, of ownership patterns that come out of these conflicts. So sometimes energy is going to be nationalized, sometimes it's going to be municipalized, so non-private ownership at the local municipal level. Sometimes it's going to be privatized, sometimes going to be cooperative form, sometimes going to be a mix of all these institutional forms, which all are going to have different impacts on inequality. And I think that in the current period, these questions should really be at the heart, at the center of our discussions related to energy. And very often we found ourselves discussing what is the best technology, or we find ourselves opposing technology versus sufficiency, when at the heart of the problem and of the challenge of our contemporary era, I see conflicts over control of energy capital. And so I wanted to start with this guy. Some of you might have heard of him, Matthew Boulton. He is the son of a very rich British man. Himself, he's a businessman, an entrepreneur, an engineer, and he's actually more well known for his association with another engineer that actually was close to being bankrupt when they meet, and this other engineer is Mr. James Watt. And the two men are going to engage in a partnership, a business partnership, to produce and commercialize the first steam engines, the Watt-Boulton steam engines. And so they're going to produce the first units in this manufacturer in Birmingham, where Mr. Boulton says that what he is selling is what the entire world desires, i.e. power. And so he's indeed playing on the double meaning of the word power, the mechanical power of the steam engine, but also the economic and political power that those who produce or those who control these machines will now have. And this is really the understanding of this double meaning that I'm trying to better understand. And to do that, I'm building on a series of approaches to study energy, drawing on different strands to offer a new quantitative political economy of energy through the lens of control, ownership, and rent extraction. So the novelty here is going to be really the quantitative political economy focus and the focus on control, ownership, and rent extraction. To my knowledge, this has never been done. That being said, I'm really building on this great scholarship on energy history. One of them is what I call the techno-physical approach. Some of you might have read the books of Václav Smil, Energy and Civilization of History. But basically, this is extremely interesting for engineers, but there is basically no social sciences, no politics, no economics. Now, Fernand Braudel, a very famous historian of life itself, of the economy of societies, also has very interesting takes on energy use, in particular in the pre-industrial period. And I'm also going to draw on this type of scholarship. Of course, many of you might be aware of the work of Andreas Malm or Timothy Mitchell, Fossil Capital here by Andreas Malm, which put the questions of political power, class conflicts at the heart of their analysis. And then a third type of approach, the economic approach, so to say. So it's scholars reconstructing long series of energy consumption and energy use. And what I'm going to do here to add to this scholarship is to produce series not only of consumption and production of energy, but who owns this energy that is produced and that is distributed. And this is what I will show in a few slides. And so a key concept at the heart of this work that I'm developing is energy regimes. So actors and technologies involved in the production, distribution, and use of energy, which are shaping different modes of accumulation and different types of wealth distributions. There are two key connections here, one with the socio-technical literature and the other with the regulation theory literature in economics, which sees economic systems as modes of regulation and accumulation, which might enable stability or disruption of social relations. And so, in a nutshell, an energy regime is a set of actors which are exerting different forms of control. Among them, ownership is a key form, especially when we are interested in the distribution of wealth, and I will focus quite a bit on this one today. Control over energy assets, which can be from natural resources to energy capital to energy devices, which produce services that are essential for societies to function properly. For those of you who are interested, the database produced in the context of this work is available online and discussed much more at length in the appendix and in the book. So let me start with two basic facts before trying to illustrate the three key arguments of the book. So basic fact number one, and sorry for the untranslated slide here, but this is human power up to steam turbine, to hydraulic turbine here, steam engine here, and this is power in watts. And here we see, over time, the rising ability of humans through these technologies to harness more power. And in fact, every time we skip from one form of power-generating device, there are huge conflicts over who can control the new power associated with this device, this technology. So fact number one, increasing ability to harness power. Fact number two, the fossil energy system, nothing new here, is very inefficient, and it has always been very inefficient. On the left-hand side on the graph, you have primary energy use at the global level, 187 petawatt hours, so thousands of billions of kilowatt hours per year. Final energy, once losses due to electricity production and transmission are taken into account, you drop to 1 in 24. And useful energy, once losses due to use of energy devices are taken into account, and we drop to 70 petawatt-hours. So, fossil energy system, very inefficient, on top of producing the pollution and the planetary inhabitability that we know of. So two basic facts. Now, the three key arguments of this book are the following. First, control over energy means controls over rents, over energy rents, and this can produce very different outcomes of wealth inequalities. Here, a very basic and relatively simple illustration with the case of Norway and Britain. So, sorry for that. Norway versus Britain, both of them are going to discover hydrocarbon resources, fossil fuel resources in the North Sea. They're going to start to commercialize these resources. One of the two countries will keep these resources under public control and ownership. The other will almost entirely privatize the sector, with very different outcomes in terms of public wealth. Wealth owned by the government sector in this country. This is what you see on this graph. Per adult national wealth, net of debt in Norway today amounts to 375,000 euros per adult, where in the UK this is now negative. That is, it's a country that has more debt than it has asset or public wealth. If Britain hadn't privatized its energy sector, its oil and gas sector, it would not be exactly at the level of Norway, but certainly it would not be in this negative net wealth position. So here, the way rents are distributed at the very first basic level between private and public sector might mean quite a bit in terms of the outcome distribution of wealth between public and private sector. Now, owning energy or controlling energy is not just about wealth distributions, it's also about controlling supply options. So if you care about sufficiency, if you care about how people should use energy in a way versus another way, then we should care about who controls the energy capital itself. And I think this is a very interesting case study from the United States in the 1940s and 50s. In the United States at the time, there is a growing urban electric public transport system in several US cities. Well, this energy, this way to organize transport through public electric cars is indeed not really appealing to car producers and to oil producers, to the extent that the Standard Oil Company of California and General Motors will ally in order to buy these electric cars, companies, and to make them go bankrupt. So they're going to buy them and they're going to put all these cars and pile them up like toys at a junkyard. This is entirely illegal. This was condemned, but it was condemned, it was too late. This industry was entirely defeated, apart from a few lines in San Francisco for tourists today, with lasting consequences on how North Americans, should use energy for their transportation modes. And for decades, consequences lasting decades. So controlling energy and controlling energy capital here also means controlling supply options, how people should use energy. And here's the third and maybe most important argument in the book. Energy ownership is a political choice. And here I'm illustrating this looking at electricity production. So bear with me, right now we're just looking at electricity production. So one dimension of the energy system and of the energy regimes. What you see on this graph is from 1900 to 2025, the share of energy production that is controlled by public or cooperative actors. And so between 1900 and 1940, very low share of public or cooperative actors in the US or in France. Much higher share in the UK, where you have more municipal ownership of the growing electricity sector, small but growing at the time. 1946 in France, law of nationalization of the electricity sector, you move from less than 10% to close to 100% of the sector under government-owned firms and companies. In the US, it's a different story. Roosevelt in the 1930s is very upset with private for-profit electricity suppliers. He called them evil companies because the rates and the prices are too high, according to him. He would like to nationalize them, but it's complicated in the US, so he will nationalize just some of them. He will create the Tennessee Valley Authority, still operating today. He will also push, Roosevelt, municipal ownership of energy and cooperative ownership. So a kind of a mixture of ownership forms to try to re-embed private actors in a broader set of forms of ownership which control private for-profit capital. And you see that in the US, it remains rather small, but the legacy of the New Deal is still here today. In the UK, complete reversion of what happened in 1947, 1946 with the privatization of the Thatcher era. And happy to talk about India and China in the discussion, but I see I have 4 minutes and 50 seconds left, so let me move forward. I won't get into the detail of this. I just want to say that countries in the first part of the 20th century, often they try to regulate the energy sector from outside. They don't want their governments to take full control over it, so they're going to try to regulate it, but this is going to be very hard, and in the end, the case of France or the case of the UK would be very illustrative of this. They go for full-on nationalization. And of course, I was looking at electricity before, but if you look at coal, if you look at gas and oil, you would also have a very rich history of conflicts between public and private sector. Here, this is oil production and capital ownership in the UK, 1900-2025. You have, so these are terawatt hours of primary energy produced by public actors in orange or private actors in blue. And you have here, again, Thatcherian privatization. But what's also quite interesting is that before the privatization, public orange share goes to zero, you also have a reduction here of the private production because, well, there are also nationalizations happening in other parts of the world. Middle Eastern countries take back control of these assets in the 1970s, which is another form of nationalization, which is part of this rich history of conflicts over who should own energy capital. That's the case of coal in the UK. Let me skip that just to say that this guy here, he's a British MP, Mr. Brace, that says in the 1920s, I could never believe that God placed in the bowels of the earth the coal for the benefit of less than 4,000 people out of the 45 million of this country. And this is really the kind of discourse that you're going to hear in a lot of parliamentary debates in the first half of the 20th century, with a lot of discussions over, if it's not private actors, for profit, who should it be that own and that control these resources? Should it be national governments? Should it be the workers themselves? Should it be municipalities? And you see different ways to answer to these complex, complicated questions also when it comes to compensation. How should we compensate those former owners that have been expropriated? There are no easy answers to that, but my message here is that all these countries, whether you look at France, UK, India, or the US, find solutions to these complex questions in order to take back control over energy with a key objective in mind, which is redistributing wealth and power relations. So basically looking both at the New Deal, at the British Labour Party, at the French Socialists, and also the Gaullists. So there's a union between the centre-right and the left at the time in France. They have a program which is redistributing or reducing inequalities, and energy socialization is at the heart of this program. This is the New Deal which I discussed a little before, and trying to get back, come a little closer to the present, I think this is a very important and interesting case. This is Sweden in the 1970s. After the oil shocks, there's a huge dependency in the early 70s in terms of district heating on petroleum products here in green. And you see that they're almost entirely replaced by biomass, so urban heating systems. Now, what is quite interesting in this case is that this rise here is almost essentially run, managed, controlled by municipal ownership companies, municipal ownership of energy. So close to users that are not consumers, that are basically citizens and users, and co-decision makers through their municipal legislative bodies. So here it's a relatively recent form of, let's say, local level social democratic ownership of energy systems. And of course, in other countries, this happened differently, and you have private for-profit actors that stepped in from the 1980s onwards. This is a political choice. It's not determined by technology itself. And so, before I conclude, let me say just a few words on the current situation. So, on this graph, you have the evolution of private wealth in various rich countries today and public wealth. So private wealth here has been rising from about 300% when expressed as a share of national income to about 600%. That is, private actors own the equivalent of 3 times GDP in 1970. Now they own collectively the equivalent of 6 times GDP. Capital is back, right? After a decline in the 20th century. It's rising again. Now, countries have become richer, but governments have become poor. Public wealth, so everything owned by governments net of debt, was about 50 to 100% of GDP, the equivalent of half a year or a full year of GDP, dropped to 0%. And sometimes it's actually lower than 0%. This is when you have more debt than you have assets. And of course, the privatization of energy, of many industries in 1970s, 80s, and 90s, at very low value, contributed to this decline, along with the rise of public debt. And so a key question for governments that are here is, how can they invest in the energy transition, potentially in these key infrastructures, when they have relatively little fiscal space? And one of the answers here is that look back at history. In 1946, for instance, when France nationalized the electricity sector, the gas sector, the coal sector, well, its economic indicators were also in the red. That is, was highly indebted. It had very bad economic indicators. And this did not prevent the country to basically nationalize energy. And a part of this is get extra resources through taxation in particular. Now, this point is to say that huge investments are required in the context of the energy transition. So that's the net national investment needs per year, about 4% of global GDP every year between now and 2050. And depending on who will make these investments, who will control the infrastructure, this can have very radically opposite impacts on the inequality of wealth. And this is work we've done with Cornelia Moran, Philippe Botta, and Gregor Semyonuk, looking at the global inequality of wealth between now and 2050. So top 1% wealth share, they own about 30% of everything to own, the top 1%. The top 10%, that was about 3/4, remember at the beginning. Top 1% is about 39%. If that top 1% does all the investments associated with necessary climate investments and owns these investments, their wealth share could rise to 46%. And if we take a polar opposite scenario where all these investments are actually financed by a wealth tax on the top 1%, this is just a thought experiment here, well, their wealth could drop to 26%. So who is going to make and own these energy investments, these climate-related investments, is absolutely key when we think about global wealth inequality. So I will skip this for the moment. And I will conclude by saying that energy regimes have radically changed in the past towards more or less collective and democratically owned infrastructures, and they will likely change again in the future. Now, no trajectory is predetermined. Socio-technical innovations without political coalition fails. This is an example of the solar houses of MIT in 1940, very innovative forms of low fossil fuel energy use, but that didn't have coalitions, political coalitions. So basically, home developers said, well, actually, we won't build these things because the electricity providers, they don't want to connect this to the grid. So without political coalitions, socio-technical innovation fails. And so let me conclude on this. Who controls energy? History really opens up the realm of possibilities. There's a diversity of pathways that we observe throughout history. Major programs aimed at reducing inequality really placed energy control at the heart of their political platforms. The low-carbon transition reopens this question, and energy strategies are never purely technical. They involve political, collective trade-offs over the distribution of wealth. And clearly, the challenge of decarbonization is inseparable from the distribution of power within the energy regimes of tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for this talk. We invited Nikita, Saad, and Alfredo, Saad-Filho, for their reflection on the topics you've been treating. So Nikita Saad is professor of the politics of development at the University of Oxford, researching the politics of land and of the institutional, political, and financial mechanisms that underlie renewable energy transitions and climate change in the global south. And this brought her to questions more recently on the intersections of democracy and anti-democracy in conflicts of environmental destruction and climate change. And so we're very curious to hear your reaction, Nikita, to the topics of today.
Thank you for the invitation to this panel. I have to admit that I don't read French, and therefore I have not read the book I will be discussing. I will wait for the English translation to come out. So I was, while Lucas was talking, his magisterial history of ownership and energy and inequality, I was reminded of the children's party game, Pin the Tail on the Donkey. Nothing to do with your talk, but really how I'm coming at this talk. I have imagined, over the last few days what your talk might be like, and I am pinning my comments on that sort of donkey. So this is going to be interesting. So I read the abstracts of your book in different forms, and that sort of, pins different bits on the donkey. And as you were speaking, this was really, I absolutely take your point about energy being about control, being about power, and it always has been throughout history and now. Energy is very much, as you were saying, also about who owns the sources of energy, whether we're talking about oil wells or coal mines or shipping routes, as we are seeing in today's Trumpian world. So it's very much about who owns these sources and who gets to control them, gets to be sort of the king of the world. I read that and heard ideas of control and ownership as property, and how capital legitimizes itself. I want to shift track a little bit, and I will end my 10 minutes with a question for you. But from who has the right to derive benefits from these sources of energy, oil wells, solar panels, or whatever else? I really wanted to only slightly change the pin I'm putting on the donkey to who has the ability to do so, right? So not just the right of property ownership, but the ability to derive benefits from things. And that takes us to perhaps something that's in the book, and I'd love to hear more about the institutional architecture that makes this ability possible, who enables the billionaires, oil billionaires, and now renewables billionaires that we are seeing in so many parts of the world, including places like China and India. So I really want to talk about that institutional architecture that enables the ability to benefit from these sources of energy. And I thought I'd divide that into one, a control over ideas. Talking about the now. I'm not going to go over, the hundreds of years you were talking about, but even at the present, one of the sets of ideas that enables how energy is being thought about and how it is being manifested on the ground materially is this very powerful concept of the just transition. So, take everyone along, leave no one behind. This will be justice in the form of distribution, or justice in the form of, how procedures are formulated. So we have, all these ideas at COPs, etc., about, just energy transition partnerships and cooperation between richer and poorer countries, because, of course, energy, and especially green energy, is a public good, solution to climate change, etc. But thinking about how those ideas are being shaped, it is very much being taken over as, and agreeing with you, we're talking about that architecture, by the McKinseys and the ENYs, etc. So the idea of just transition as an enabling factor in who gets to control energy begins with on-the-ground movements, very popular movements of, I don't know, in my country, India, women in villages hugging trees that were being chopped down by contractors with the enablement of the government. So ideas of just transition really begin there, and justice and climate really begin there, and are now owned or controlled by governments, by the COP architecture, the Conference of Parties, the UN Environment Program, and the people who partner them, so the McKinseys of the world. I think it was Bain, if you go to their website, it says something like, nature is the new frontier, right? So this is very much a control over ideas and the architecture that enables what you were talking about. The second is the sorts of practices that go with this control, who gets to control the ideas and the practices that enable your, capitalist billionaires. And those practices really, and again, you touched upon it, and maybe you need more time to talk about, the practices of the state. So, the green developmental state is very much back in fashion. Industrial policy is very much back in fashion, and green industrial policy. But in the parts of the world I work on, which are largely, the big coal economies, India, Indonesia, China, it is not just the green developmental state as a formal entity, it is everything that it does around that formality, which is, go to frontier regions of their countries, which are often minoritized regions, conflict-prone regions, and take over, 500 square kilometers of land in the name of security. So, this is the green developmental state gone a bit rogue and, working with middlemen, violence, mercenaries, etc., to enable the property you're talking about. So the kinds of practices, both legal and policy derived, so industrial policy, etc., but also the illegal and underhand practices that go into controlling, and having benefits from energy derived by the private ownership that your talk was focusing on. So the role of the state, but not just the green developmental state, the sort of very unjust state, the state as it is, rather than how it might be in a book. And then, of course, energy is, as you said, very much about power and politics and the sort of everyday tussles around who gets to control, factors of production, who gets to control, I'm done?
No, 2 minutes.
Yeah. Who gets to control the decision-making in, planning commissions, in ministries of energy, in the kind of, field research I do. Increasingly, I find the big energy companies, who could be the old oil companies who are now getting into, say, renewables, literally sitting in state planning commissions, right? They have offices in the heart of the state, and they are working with the state to enable, their takeover of territory, their control over, solar panels and wind turbines, etc. So this is politics as a tussle over resources, and a very different idea of green as taking everyone along, as possibly opening up roads to more equality, better taxation. In the parts of the world I'm familiar with, that is not the story. The story is old capital getting into greener energy, being enabled by ideas, by practices, and very much by politics. And then, of course, there's the question, and again, I think you touched upon it, how is this even possible? So, if a private company is sitting inside the heart of government and often dictating or at least shaping policy, why don't we have rebellions? What is going on? And it takes us back to this idea of hope and green and just. That might be one. But the other is very much the kind of authoritarian politics that we are seeing in the global north and in the global south, where you have, the villainized minorities, the benefit seekers, etc., who become the foil to this, authoritarian state capital embrace. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm just talking about the sort of power and everyday architecture that makes possible your very nice talk. And I wanted to, I have one question to ask you, and I would like you to talk about the institutions in this swathe of time you gave us, and in the contemporary, that are making possible the kinds of inequalities that you began with, and that you said, there is hope, and the curve could really go down, and we could have, taxation, etc. And you spoke about the role of the state. I would like to hear more about, is this possible? What would this state look like, given the state of the state right now?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Nikita. Our second discussant is Alfredo Saad-Filho. Sorry. Yes, thank you. Professor of International Political Economy at Queen's University, Belfast, and his research on how neoliberalism restructures economies and societies, and your recent publications on the intersection with climate change and unsustainability of economic systems makes me very curious to reflection on the topics of today.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you, Lucas, for this wonderful talk. Several speakers at this conference, particularly Joita at the Dudley Sears lecture yesterday, and Luca now confirmed that climate change poses an existential threat to neoliberal capitalism and an existential threat to the survival of billions of the most vulnerable people on Earth. And these are different challenges. Now, crossing climate tipping points, collapse of the Amazon rainforest, Greenland ice sheets, weakening of the Atlantic circulation, they'll devastate many of our largest cities, possibly including this one, destroy infrastructure that has been built over centuries, disrupt supply chains, destabilize financial systems, and completely destroy the insurance industry, without which nothing, literally nothing, can work. And the sea will keep on rising for thousands of years. What's happening now will be remembered, and far, far into the future will be known for failure. These challenges are also linked to unavoidable state failures and additional losses of political legitimacy across the world, with implications that we can only imagine. Poor people and the poorest nations that are the least responsible for emissions, as was shown today, already suffer heavy losses because of climate change. And it is in this context that Lucas shows that the energy transition is connected to the choice of energy regime, and it implies a choice about inequality. He also shows that fossil regimes are fed by inequality and generate it. It's always important to remember that the top 10% of the population accounts for 3/4 of emissions, the bottom 50% accounts for 3.5%. This aggregate framing is crucial because it moves attention away from individual consumer behavior and the notion of carbon footprint. That's a concept pushed by an advertising agency that was hired by BP, the oil company. Instead, a political economy approach directs attention to ownership, to investment decisions, and to the choice of technology, none of which are within the reach of individual consumers, but all of which are controlled by capital and are within the reach of states. Lucas gives us tools to understand what's going on and what is possible. He shows that all the great redistributive projects of the 20th century included some form of socialization of energy. But the neoliberal wave of privatization, what it did was to transfer vast wealth to private hands and contribute to the heavy concentration of energy ownership that we see today. System change and energy regime change are essential, but there's no clear prospect that they will happen before we breach climate tipping points. The political conditions that enabled the socialization of energy in the past, mass labor movements, anti-colonial nationalism, credible socialist alternatives, they're all absent. North, South, working class, inequalities in political pressures undermine the possibility of united fronts, and the political trend runs in the opposite direction, with right-wing authoritarian leaders deepening extractivist capitalism as a short-term fix for economic stagnation, even if extraction is only driving meaningless accumulation, plunder, and fraud, sometimes driven by those very leaders. Now, given that capitalism will be hard-pressed to cope with apocalyptic global warming, and that counter-hegemonic forces may not coalesce in time to overthrow it, what might happen possibly is a state-mediated accommodation between capital and the climate. And this is possible after the Second World War. Faced with the threat of socialist revolutions, Western elites made significant concessions in wages, housing, public services, and rights of citizenship. So climate change might push states and capital to adapt and steer capital gradually away from fossil fuels. And Lucas shows that political choices do shape energy mixes. The lesson is clear. Markets alone, with or without the invention of carbon markets, they cannot drive the transformation that is needed. Public policy is essential, and it can be effective within boundaries. Jean-Baptiste Fressoz shows that energy transitions have always been additive, not substitutive. The transition as replacement narrative is another invention of lobbyists. And Lucas shows that private ownership alone does not deliver universal access, and it will not deliver rapid decarbonization. But even if renewables capitalism could be achieved, its social and geographical implications would be deeply uneven. Climate stabilization above the now defunct 2-degree limit would condemn billions of mostly poor people to permanent deprivation and possible death. But this is not a problem from the point of view of capital or northern states, because these people are effectively surplus to requirements. This might change in a bad way if large numbers try to migrate north because of climate pressures, in which case either Europe and North America will open their arms and welcome hundreds of millions of new citizens, or in the coming years they'll militarize their borders to a degree we cannot anticipate today. Just guess what's going to happen. A renewables capitalism will also intensify the extraction of lithium, nickel, copper, and other minerals, generating new dispossessions and new resource curses, and it will have severe implications for fossil fuel-dependent economies like Angola and Nigeria. The conclusion is uncomfortable. The most likely scenario is a new round of additive transition with state-guaranteed profits on renewables, on top of state subsidies to cover losses for stranding hundreds of billions of dollars in the fossil fuel infrastructure. Where's the fiscal capacity to do this? Space for change will emerge only with strong counter-hegemonic movements demanding equality, autonomy, ecological security, and a variety of forms of ownership of energy, as Luca has stressed. These movements must force capital to make concessions to stabilize the climate without destroying too many lives and without concentrating wealth even more in the process. Our choices about the future have to be made consciously and democratically. They cannot be left to billionaires, sovereign wealth funds, and authoritarian states. Thank you, and thank you, Lucas, for this excellent talk. My question to you is, knowing what we know, what do we do now in the time we have available? Easy.
Thank you, Alfredo. Luca, I will give you the opportunity to answer to our discussions.
Well, thank you very much, Nikita and Alfredo, for these great comments. I very much agree with your just transition mantra, basically, which is very often used to guarantee anything but a just transition, and it's often framed as, okay, let's compensate the losers at the margin, rather than asking the hard questions of power relations, of structures of ownership. And in part, this is related to, yes, where these ideas are framed and generated. You're assigning some consulting agency, and I think the work of Jean-Baptiste Fressoz about no transition and the use of the word transition is somewhat related to how these words are very heavy in the meaning they carry, and in making us think that something is happening, which actually they are here to prevent from this thing to happen. But how to make these things happen? So first, I would say that we need to realize that, or acknowledge that, yeah, billionaires, some of them are currently investing massively in low carbon solutions. Yeah. Actually, in the US, in fact, you see the Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft actually investing quite massively in nuclear, restarting the nuclear unit in front of the one that exploded, or where there was an incident in the late 1970s in 3 Mile Island. So Microsoft restarts this nuclear power plant because they want to centralize electricity generation. They see it's a low carbon source. They don't think about the other issues associated with it. But it's kind of a neo form of privatization of electricity, which is in a way going back to the beginning of the 20th century, where you have firms, big industries that were vertically integrating from electricity production to many of the stuff that they were producing. So we are back to this model of integration of energy and other things. And why do they do this? Because they know very well that if they don't control the electricity itself, they will be at risk. If it's other actors, like government actors, they will be at risk. So this is also why you see Facebook also trying to develop a nuclear reactor in California. So far, they've been stopped thanks to a very rare local species of bee in this area. And so biodiversity law was stronger than Facebook in this case. But of course, Facebook is very powerful and wants to establish or develop other forms of either nuclear or other alternatives to produce their energy, their electricity. And so, against the power of these actors, for me, states are a condition, but that is necessary but not sufficient for an actual redistribution of wealth and power within planetary boundaries. So speaking to your point that, yes, states, they can be oppressive, authoritarian, and not at all in favor of more redistribution. But it is a condition to control these very powerful private for-profit actors. And I think that's quite interesting in the history of energy is when you have this alliance between the national level and more decentralized form of energy production and distribution and use, and also power decision levels when they are decentralized. So I cited the Swedish case, for instance, where you have municipal level ownership, which never worked without a very strong alliance with the national level. Basically, you have a state that through regulations, access through credit, economic policies that is going to facilitate local level ownership. This is the same with the New Deal. When Roosevelt, at the time, he's very inspired by the cooperatives of Scandinavian countries in the 1930s. He asks a report, and he's going to be like, okay, let's develop cooperatives in the energy sector in the US. And again, here it's an alliance between the state and the local level. And of course, none of this can happen without strong unions, popular movements, coalitions from the bottom. And when it works, it's really these different actors, local level policy actors, national level policy actors with strong movements that always keep an equilibrium between different scales, levels of power. And of course, this is absolutely paramount. Now, I don't have the solution to how to make this happen. What I know is that, or at least my argument is that ecology without addressing upfront these class conflicts, these demands and need for radical redistribution of wealth and power cannot work and will not work. And so to speak to your point of how to answer the racist and xenophobic politics of our time, well, back to Roosevelt here again. Basically, the way they addressed the politics of racism and xenophobia in 1920-30 US was with politics of radical redistribution at the time, which also included at the heart of their program taking back control over these key infrastructures, starting with energy, but also water and many other infrastructures. But so my general point is that energy is one of the many dimensions on which you need to have collective democratic control. States are necessary but not sufficient for this to happen, and you need this variety of actors which in many cases have worked hand in hand together. And this is what we see in many countries. Now, in India, I think that what was quite interesting is that you have the nationalization movement of the coal industry, for instance, in the 1970s, when Nehru basically argues that, well, just shifting ownership from British private for-profit interest to Indian billionaires of the time was not sufficient. And so then there is this movement for nationalization. Now what I see is that in certain Indian states, the electricity sector is owned by the state, but very inefficient. And you have local level solutions, some municipally owned solar panel electricity production, but basically that do not have enough support from the government to be financially sustainable. So here, I think that we really need to create these alliances between these different levels and scales of power of control over energy for this to work against this shift of reprivatization, which is, likely to happen in several parts of the world.
Thank you. Keeping a look at the time, I would maybe briefly want to gauge how many of you have questions for our panelists, and raise your hands. Yeah, quite a bit. So I would maybe invite the microphones, the running microphones. Yes, so there are people here and have maybe 4 questions for this round, and then hear the responses from the panelists. So let's collect 4. Okay.
Thank you, Lucas, for the very insightful presentation. I'm Sandeepan. I come from India. In fact, some of the responses that I was seeking, you already clarified in this round of question answer, so thanks for that as well. But nevertheless, let me go ahead and ask. One is that, as you said, energy is just one of the many dimensions. Just now as a response, I was just thinking that are you not drawing from the framework of the ownership of means of production and energy as an appendage to that? And that could perhaps energy and many other dimensions can be covered as part of, if you use that framing. That's one question. Second was, again, in your, partly you touched upon the contradictory nature, what has happened in India, China, and again, now you were saying about nationalization of energy in India. So I was just thinking that maybe it is there in the book, but in the presentation, somehow, it appears like a linear channel instead of contradictions. So this nationalization of energy was not just an India story, a Nehruvian story. In fact, the whole of West Asia, there was an attempt to nationalize, which was again taken back by imperialism. So I was just thinking, is that the narrative, that there are these contradictions that emerged in time in history as a part of the energy control story? But it was, and in the process, something moved forward, but not as much, and therefore there is hope, and there are such contradictions which you already mentioned in your response. So these are 2 questions that I would like you to reflect on. Maybe,
sorry, you go ahead, and then we move to there in the back. Yes.
Your examples of energy nationalization, to extent were by good governments. If we can agree for a moment on what good governments were, relatively democratic, relatively benevolent. One of the arguments for not having nationalization of means of production, including energy, is that governments are not always democratic and are not always benevolent, and you need alternative centers of power. What do you see as the answer to this? And a second related question, what do you see as the answer to a change in government, which may then reallocate the energy to large multinationals, as indeed happened with North Sea Oil in the UK?
Shall I?
Yes, there's Okay.
Right. Thanks, Luca. I'm looking forward to reading your book. It's actually a great presentation also. So when you listen to sort of the discussion here, and I also felt that way about the keynote yesterday, you would almost think that we live in a universe that is controlled by billionaires and that the people somehow need to rise and take back power. But the thing is that in democracies, of course, people are actually in power. And the reason that we have billionaires and the reason that we have privatized energy systems is because people democratically chose this, right? not to their own advantage probably, but nevertheless came about through democratic processes. So is there also something that we can learn from the past, perhaps how in France in the 30s the power system was nationalized, that we can learn something about how, practically speaking, the things that you are proposing can be made politically acceptable, such that there is a democratic majority to actually make it happen, rather than just preach that it should happen. But of course, we need to operate in a democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lucas, for your presentation. I came a bit late, so I wouldn't know whether you spoke about some of the issues I want to talk about or want to raise. Talking about sustainability and equity, did you consider countries in Africa or part of the global south where some of these energy resources come from? And then did you consider those at the margins in communities where these extractive activities take place? Because I was in one of the panel sessions yesterday where they discussed reparations, and I remembered somebody talking about what we put forth as payments for damages done in such communities compared to the damage done is actually like not comparable. So in discussions around sustainability, equity, or even democratic practices, who gains, who benefits, who becomes richer or poorer, what happens to those that actually suffer these losses? So I want to know that whether in your book, did you consider these aspects of those at the margins in some of these countries from where these resources are exported to the West to drive energy systems? What is actually happening in such regions? Thank you.
Maybe we give a chance to the panelists to respond to the issues raised before we have a second round of questions.
So thank you very much for these great questions and comments. I think the first comment and question related to why not go beyond discussing energy ownership and ownership within the broader economy. And my answer here is related to the billionaire story which I just presented, or the multinationals currently investing in energy, because this is an essential input in anything they do, in anything we do. And even if we are in the digital world, it's very far from being immaterial. In fact, the immaterial world is very material, and energy is absolutely required for these investments. So basically, if you care about ownership structure in the rest of the economy, my argument would say that, well, you need to start with energy, and then you can move on to other sectors. But energy is absolutely crucial as this essential input in any form of production. Now, on contradictions and tensions between, nationalizations in Southeast Asia and East Asia over the past 50 years that do not necessarily always produce more equality, let alone more sustainability. Yes, I think my point is not to say that nationalization is a sufficient condition for equitable outcomes, democratic outcomes. What I'm trying to say is that it is a necessary condition for it. And this relates to the point of democracy, authoritarian regimes. Well, of course, authoritarian regimes are going to try to size energy assets because it's so important to control the rest of society, clearly. Some interesting case is that being said, within the energy sector, in a country like China, for instance, you see that energy is where actually you have some political conflicts between different levels of where political power is exerted. So between central, regional, and local on the ownership of mines, to what extent you're going to follow decarbonization impetus of the national level and resistance at the local level around energy this is where you see actually political conflicts happening. So energy really is where some form of resistance to centralized power also happens in countries where power might be extremely centralized. But it's true that in everything I've said in this talk, it's on the premise that these are democratic countries with a relatively equal voice to citizens. And then this relates to the question of how to move from, just preaching in the desert versus actually action. Now, one of the first points I was trying to make is that these movements of nationalization, socializations, whether the Rooseveltian movement or the social democratic, but kind of radical social democratic movement of the mid-European 20th century, in fact, they are all based on decades of individuals, unions, groups, coalitions preaching in the desert to some extent, putting these ideas in the public. And so what seems radical at some point of time, you can see that 15 years down the line, it's become absolutely banal, absolutely consensual. This is exactly what happened to electricity socialization, which was really seen as something that was completely Soviet communism in France in the 1930s, and which becomes absolutely banal in the 1950s. Everybody's for, right? So you can have these kind of radical shift in what is legitimate and what is not in terms of the energy ownership. So I think that is quite interesting to follow. And then you can have the reverse shift in the UK, where something that was very legitimate, which was, state centralized ownership of energy, which becomes really the evil thing. And to some extent, there might be some kind of a reversion, to some extent, at least discontent, as the architecture of this energy regime has been organized since then. I've heard some calls for the nationalization of BP in the UK. I've heard similar calls for the nationalization of Total Energies in France. And I do think that these are the key just transition topics that we should discuss. How do you take back control over these firms in order to actually transform them, to actually prevent them from doing what they do? And this may sound kind of utopian, but I'm quite convinced that maybe in 20 years down the line, this might be not the case anymore. And maybe final point on billionaires, well, yes, there are very powerful billionaires today. They were also very powerful, they were not billionaires at the time, but Rockefeller, richest man of his time, well, Roosevelt decides to, have 100% tax on the incomes of Rockefeller. He's not going to manage to actually do it because Congress at the time thinks it's a little too high, 100% tax. But so they're going to have a negotiation, and in the end, it's going to be a 93.5% tax on top marginal incomes in the US. And so, again, something that might seem very radical at some point of time, then is implemented by Roosevelt, and then this very, very high top marginal income tax rate will be maintained in the US until the 1980s, the Reaganian Revolution, whether Republicans or Democrats are going to continue on these supposedly radical ways to approach economics. So I think that would be my answer to your question. And maybe last one, reparations. And of course, related to climate change, there's a huge deal of historical responsibilities. And so one way to think about that, I think, is, and connected with this kind of who owns energy discussion, socialization of energy, of potentially new technologies, of potentially some patents in the energy sector can make it possible to have a much easier spreading and sharing of these patents and these technologies with countries which will have difficulties to do these investments by themselves. And so, when it's going to be private for-profit firms that develop, these new, whether it's home insulation or new technologies of solar panels, is going to be very difficult to, open these patents to countries that basically could produce them on their soil, but do not have access to the actual intellectual property rights. And so I think here, socialization of the production of energy devices is one way to facilitate, accelerate the spreading of these technologies. And that's one way, in fact, to think about some transfers between rich and poor countries. here in terms of intellectual property rights. It's not a substitute to a more precise discussion on reparations, but I think it should be understood as part of the discussion on transfers between Global North and Global South. And again, I think it's related to who owns these firms, to who owns these intellectual property rights related to these technologies.
Thank you. Nikita, would you like to add on any issues raised, or not for the moment? Alfredo? No? Okay, then I'll like to invite the second round of questions, because I saw many hands raised that were not yet able to hear. And there's one question from the audience online, which I will read as the fourth question. Okay, the microphones are... Yeah, so we have two questions there on the same row.
Can I? Yeah, thank you very much for the very rich talk. I would like, Lucas, I would like to link back to the first person who asked the question on state governance. Now you lumped everything together: cooperatives, local governance, national governance. And then you remarked that it's important to see within states how exactly who exactly is representing public governance here. Huh? Is it local governments? Is it national governments? Is it cooperatives? And does your story hold still if you're looking at local government and cooperatives? I mean, what would be the difference between private governance and local governments competing also for energy and control? Does your kind of theoretical reasoning still hold in that case? How do local governments do in comparison to the national level control?
Hello. I think it's working. Yeah, I'm Caroline Cornier. I'm a PhD student at Manchester, and I was wondering how you see the rise of China, how it relates, and its total control of the solar panel industry. How does it impact the crossroads that the energy sector is at? And also, why do you think we have to focus on ownership, and are there not also other mechanisms that can lead to more equity?
Hi, just thanks for the talk. I wanted to go back to the point on efficiency, right? So, and so thinking about, for instance, Latin American countries, and the point that was made before that, so right now, I mean, although I totally agree with you, I don't see the argument in Latin America for nationalization, right? I mean, everyone will be like, you crazy, no, you communists, like, look at Venezuela and look at Cuba. So, yeah, I don't know, and it may be a point on efficiency investments. I mean, there are very bad examples of nationalization in Latin America, and that's why right now I don't see the argument having any leverage.
Is anyone else holding a microphone and waiting for... Okay.
Can I speak?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, just quickly, thank you for the great talk, and also Alfredo and Nikita for kind of drawing attention to the value of the grassroots. And I kind of bridge academia and activism, and I find a lot of the time, you know, academics, we're great at pointing to the problem, but then the pressure is often put on the activists and the grassroots, and you highlighted the importance of a counter-hegemonic struggle for kind of any hope in creating change. So my question is, how can, as academics, we be better rooted in counter-hegemonic struggles, taking what, you know, the very blunt vision of the future you put forward, Alfredo, outside of rooms like this, and being better guides and rooted in these struggles, so that it's not on a very small minority for us to question, do we go to prison or do we stay out of prison so that we can continue organising, which is the questions that we're currently faced with.
Okay, as is the final round, I will invite one more question by the lady over there, and then give you the opportunity to select. Well, maybe we start with Alfredo and Nikita this time to select on the issues you'd like to respond to. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the floor. For me, I will just ask a question about electricity. access to electricity, because I think it's part of energy access. I made a research on cash power, or some kind of electricity that is designed for low-income countries. And what do you think about this reality? Is it a kind of equity, or to fight from when, for instance, we are designing this kind of technology, cash power, or I don't know if you know about cash power, but this kind of technology is designed for a consumer in order to be more efficient. Do you consider it as a kind of redistribution or equity also? Thank you.
Okay. We are now at the time where we should close, but as we took a bit more minutes of delay in the beginning, I think please take your time, Alfredo, to...
No, very quickly. I think the question about what to do and activism is essential, because issues of climate transition and sustaining democracy, they will not be decided in academic conferences. They will be decided outside. I think we as academics and as scholars, we have a very important role in this. We have networks, we have contacts, we have access to experiences, and we can cross-fertilize those experiences, and we can inform groups of people who are willing to do what needs doing in those cases. So it's a very important role, but we don't decide anything. The decision is taken elsewhere. It is also true that it is becoming increasingly risky to be politically active today. The UK is certainly a case in point. We heard yesterday other examples from Belgium, but I'm sure there will be examples from wherever people here come from. The escalation of repression is a fact, and people must judge. They must understand the risks that they are taking. But it is important to do something and not to let those forces of repression keep us separated, keep us at home, keep us intimidated, because this is exactly what they want to do. And if we accept that, then absolutely the world is going to collapse, because the direction in which the forces that have power are taking humanity, those directions cannot be accepted. So all we can say is pass an expression of hope and try to cross-fertilize experiences of success. We dearly need experiences of success. There are experiences of success in different continents, in Latin America, in Europe, in other parts of the world. We can try and push those experiences and then be steadfast in resisting against the forces of repression, pushing back against the rising tide of authoritarianism and fascism in the world today. And I'm using the word fascism very carefully, and try to contribute in a way that in 30 years' time, in 40 years' time, we'll be proud to say, I did this, I was there, and I played a very small but positive role in that battle. Thank you.
Just carrying on from those rallying comments, I think the discussion, fascinating discussion today has been very much about energy and development as is versus what can be. And I think when you were talking about the power of ideas and what is possible, what you thought wasn't possible 20 years ago, it was very much nudging us to think big about what can be. Whereas a lot of the questions have been about, well, this is how it is, and it's authoritarian, and the state is taken over, etc. And I guess at the Development Studies Conference, that dichotomy, but how to make it meet is something to be thinking about. And the activism question spoke to me about that dichotomy, what is versus what can be. And I think in the UK, we are, and I'm sure everywhere else, we're constantly being pushed to think about the impact and, you know, public engagement that our research has. And many of us, you know, want to be in our libraries and write, etc. But, you know, increasingly in the deeply authoritarian world we are in, I totally see the, you know, the importance of that kind of work. And just to give you a very small and hopeful example, I have been working with fishing communities in Indonesia who are protesting the takeover of an entire island, something like 17,000 hectares, for large solar farms and also solar panel production facilities. And I have been working with these communities, but also with school children in the UK, high school children, to put these, you know, very different worlds in touch. And we have a fascinating series of videos, you know, TikTok size videos being produced by, you know, relatively privileged young kids in the UK, talking about the sort of underbelly of green transition and, you know, energy justice, etc. And I think to be part of these conversations is very much a duty that, you know, we should all be taking very seriously, which might help us bridge this, you know, vast divide between what is and what can be. And then there was an earlier question about local governments and national, and, you know, how energy needs to be seen across these divides, and, you know, the federal nature of energy politics. I was thinking about fieldwork in China, where local governments want to do everything all at once. So they will take the signals from up above and work very closely with coal businesses to do everything, to give land over to, you know, solar farms while keeping the coal mine going, while trying to compensate workers, which really makes me think about the granularity of institutions that must be part of this debate, right? So ownership and taxation and, you know, what have we done to the state over the last 30, 40 years, which is now being entrusted with, you know, this massive job of doing something about climate change. And I think that's what many of us should be studying. So, you know, not the green state alone and not industrial policy alone, but the granular nature, you know, where these struggles are actually happening. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I leave the word to you for concluding remarks.
Very, very quick, and I won't be able to address all the comments and questions, but I think, speaking to what you just said, I think that political forces advocating for more redistribution in many instances over the past decades internalized some constraints and limitations imposed by billionaires. So basically, it's impossible to tax the rich. It's impossible to reclaim control over key infrastructure. It's impossible to have, you know, functioning basic services for everybody. It's impossible because public sector is inefficient, for instance. And at the same time, one thing that this energy history shows is that there's nothing inherently inefficient in public sector ownership of the energy sector. And in fact, local level ownership sometimes can be very much more efficient than private sector ownership. One of the key differences is that it's going to be very hard with a private for-profit actor to have several objectives at the same time. So basically cheap prices and decarbonization and reduced energy use. And what you see in local level municipal ownership is really seeing consumers as users to which you want to have the, you know, lowest possible price for the service, and at the same time potentially reduce the consumption of energy itself. Basically, in these municipally owned firms, they have a mandate not just to sell energy, but to help users reduce their consumption, which is going to be very hard to get that kind of outcome with a private for-profit actor. I'm not saying you can't. You can try to regulate it, to tax it, but it's going to be much harder to do that from the outside as a regulator than from the inside as an owner. On China, well, a lot can be said and should be said about how basically it really was able to understand that if you shock the global energy system with new sources of energy, that's a key moment where you're redistributing power and you can seize a lot of power if you control these new sources of energy. And since the 1980s onwards, that's precisely what Chinese government has done with a lot of efficiency, efficacy, also looking at how European countries organized their industrial policies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, with mixed private and public ownership. Sometimes public ownership works, sometimes it doesn't work so well. You have a mixed kind of economy, but you have a planning, ecological planning, which is really what worked in China. And sometimes people tell me that other countries can't do this because it's China, it's so centralized control. But actually, they are doing the kind of policies that you see in the US, in the UK, or in France from 1950s to the 1980s onwards on the industrial side. And to finish, I think that between dependency to Chinese technologies and or billionaire electricity, we need to have alternatives. And I think that what that research shows is that we do have alternatives. And decarbonization, from my perspective, should be embedded in redistribution. Otherwise, it just won't work.
Thank you. That leaves me to thank again the speakers of today and also you as audience for being here and your very rich inputs and feedbacks. And I wish you invite you for a lunch, which will be served outside here. Thank you, and thank you.